Amen. 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 So we've been working through. So we're now in Matthew 22. Matthew 22. We could have called it, and everyone would have known, "Render unto Caesar," because that's the phrase that's actually an incredibly well known and famous phrase. We'll think a little bit about why, because it's actually had quite significant implications right the way through history and in the world even today. With people who aren't necessarily believers taking the logic of it and applying it elsewhere. But I thought, just to give it a slightly different title, I'd call it taxes and dues, just to kind of make it slightly more standing out in the way we think about it. But it's very easy when we get into this passage to forget actually how close it is to the turning over of the money tables. It's only a chapter away, and I was thinking about this just as I was preparing for this morning, that even though Matthew 21 we read about Jesus turning over the money tables, and now Matthew 22 we find this phrase, "Render unto Caesar the things that Caesar's," we kind of actually miss the emotional or the historic connection between the two. I was thinking about all the times when I've sometimes I didn't do it for today actually, having said that. But I've gone and looked at commentaries online or physical ones I own. And it almost never gets tied to the turning over of the money tables. And yet as we get there, we'll see thematically there's a very strong connection between the two. It's not the main point, and I think that's probably the reason, that there's a really powerful point that kind of flows out of the words that Jesus gives us. And so people tend to focus on those things. But we'll do a little bit of looking back at the same time as we look forward. So we're starting in verse 15 then. So then the Pharisees went out and plotted to snare Jesus in his word. So just to remind us of the context, Jesus has come in the day before. He's turned over the money tables. It's been a very busy day. There's been lots of celebration. Jesus has pretty much owned the temple space. The religious leaders, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, they've not been able to kind of push the agenda. Jesus has been in control of the agenda all the way through. And then Jesus has come back the next day. And on this next day, which includes now, there's been a kind of plan to kind of ambush Jesus with questions from different factions and different groups, which kind of takes control back, if you like, to the temple authorities. They've kind of got some semblance of now driving the agenda. And so it's in that context we then read, so the Pharisees went out, i.e. they go out into the public forum, into the court of the Gentiles, where Jesus had previously turned over the money tables. And they plotted to snare Jesus in his words, and so they sent their disciples to him. So what we get is we kind of take it slowly through the process. It's not the Pharisaic leaders who are the ones who are most against Jesus, who sit in the chair of Moses, if you like. They're the teachers and so on, but they're pushing their disciples. They're a little bit more anonymous to the crowds. They're not well known. They don't stand out as senior figures. So they sent their disciples to him, and along with, I've hyphenated along with, because it's really just the word with, but I think I wanted to kind of get across that they're there with a group called the Herodians. So the Herodians, we make some assumptions about. We can't be 100% sure on it, but they are a sort of subsect within Pharisaism. So Pharisaism isn't one monolithic sort of approach. It's a bit like we would use the phrase evangelicalism today. But evangelicalism can have a lot of very different flavours. but what we have in common is that we share a commitment. This is I'm using the definition of the Evangelical Alliance. There's a kind of a commitment to the preaching of the cross, the speaking of the message of the cross. An activist, in fact, they often use that. It's an activist commitment to the speaking of the cross, and that we take Scripture as having authority, and inspiration. Now, we can mean different things by authority and inspiration, and we can preach the cross in different ways, but we're trying to do all of those things. So there's something we can kind of have a common discussion around. And Pharisaism is not dissimilar in that sort of sense. They have a commitment to a wider set of scriptures than just the law of Moses and so on and so forth. But within that, we have different streams. And we're going to see those different streams are sort of they're kind of referenced in the text today. So the Herodians may themselves have been within the Pharisaic kind of context. And they're often seen related back to at the time when Herod the Great takes over and claims the kingship for himself, and then he starts building and he reestablishes the temple. Well, that got a lot of Pharisees very excited, you see. And so there was some kind of talk around the Herodian family and the Messiah coming from the Herodian family and him being within the context of prophecies and so on. So there has, even though we look at the Herods now with the benefit of hindsight and see them as quite a bad lot, there were certain things that they did that made the religiously minded, the Pharisaic minded, some of them see them very positively. And so in some form or other, the Herodians are probably a sort of a branch off from or a subset within that Pharisaic idea, who were very pro the Herodian family. But in particular, and this is why it kind of plays out in the story here, of course, Herod himself, well, let's do this when we get there. Let's read the words. So they sent the disciples, so the leading Pharisees, not turning up in person, getting anonymous characters to raise a question, making sure that thrown into the crowd and into the mix are some of the folks they have a certain level of connection with, but who are Herodians and who we know are going to take a very different position to the more traditional Pharisaic position on taxes. So I'm getting there already, even before we get through the words. So they say, "Teacher, we know that you are honest and you truly teach the way of God without deference to anyone because you don't pay attention to human standing." And that is a kind of a reference to the different threads and strands within Pharisaism, of which, if you like, Herodians here are a kind of, maybe they're not purely Pharisees, but they're within that sort of idea. We saw in the Sermon on the Mount, when we were going through it, that Jesus addresses the scene teaching. He addresses the teachings of the rabbi called Shammai. He addresses the teachings of the rabbi Hillel. But in all of these things, he's never so much, if you like, anti-Shammai, anti-Hillel. He often endorses what's good about what they've taught, but he gives it a novel twist. Occasionally, he does kind of confront, as he does with Hillel's position on marriage, for instance, and divorce. And so there is a very real reference to kind of, if you like, the context, but when we understand the context and we read Jesus' teaching and things like the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is very much someone who's not being driven by an agenda and a kind of a political ideology or even an association. So today, actually, of course, this is for the records because there's local elections near us, you know. And I was just thinking about this in the context of local elections, that the problem is you might have someone with real integrity who really wants to change things for the local community, you know. But to get elected, they have to align with a political party. And the trouble with the political party is it's bounded together by an ideological position. And so instead, therefore, of purely working for what's genuinely the best thing for the local community, we try to work for the best thing according to the ideology of those that we've endorsed and kind of aligned ourselves with, which then ends up leaving us a bit compromised. We can't kind of cooperate with someone who's doing the right thing because ideologically he's doing something outside of our ideology. And life gets complicated like that. And that's very often what we encounter with those who went into things with good motives, trying to get things done, but end up playing the party lines because those are the people they're with. And in this statement here, we're seeing that in a very kind of generous way, the Pharisees are approaching and driving the question, are acknowledging the fact that Jesus has endorsed what's good. He's given new twists. Occasionally he confronts, but he's not doing it from an ideological position. He's doing it from a sense of, I'm trying to do this honestly before the Father. So he's trying to teach in those ways. So we know you're honest, you truly teach the ways of God without deference to anyone because you don't pay attention to human standing. But now, in this mix, so tell us, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not? And this is where the mixing in of those who are Herodians is kind of a clever move. Because actually the question we're talking about, almost certainly, while we don't have, if you like, an exact description of the Herodian documents, Herod himself was installed with a Roman army. He was effectively put in position by the emperor in Rome, sent down to... Oops, what's happening here?
Recording in progress.
Sorry, I lost something there. Did I disappear for a minute? Did I? I think I must have lost the connection. Can anyone hear me? Hello, is anyone there? Hello, is anyone there? Can anyone hear me? I think I lost my connection. Nobody saying anything? Hello?
Yeah, we got you back now.
You got me back. Yeah, I disappeared. So I was obviously in the middle of saying something, and I was saying to Joseph right at the beginning, I had a message popped up when I started Zoom. It said my internet connection is unstable. So it looks like it just proved it, that it really is unstable. Okay, so where did I get to? I just was saying, I was talking about the clever mix of the Pharisees of putting the Herodians there, because Herod had been installed with a Roman army. He'd been elected in Rome. He'd been sent from Rome with the backing of a Roman army and forcibly installed as the king of Judea, you see. So those who are now aligned with him, the Herodians, are very much in line with the status quo of the Roman state. So in their thinking, the question of should we pay taxes to Caesar is an easy one. The answer is yes, because somehow God has acted and worked through the Roman peace and the Roman power to put somebody in place who's rebuilt the temple to as big as it's ever been. He's restoring kind of pride in their Judaism, and so they're very pro that. So that's part of the kind of cleverness of sending the more traditional Pharisaic position. And we read about some of these stories in Josephus. So they've regularly rebelled against the issue of paying tax. So we've got the slight kind of crossover in who they are ideologically, and this issue of the paying tax to Caesar is one of the dividing points. And so actually there's the potential for stirring up a huge amount of response within the people. So of course Jesus, as we read it here, but Jesus understands their duplicity, understanding their duplicity. So he says, he actually calls it out straight away, you hypocrites. When Jesus uses the word, it's the word you play actor, you stage actor. In other words, this is all a big show. You're not really asking this question. You're playing a part, because really what you're trying to do is you're testing me. So he puts the question there, and so he responds, so show me the coin used for the tribute. And they brought him the denarius. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight at the beginning the closeness of this event, it's the day after Jesus has turned over the money tables, is that, of course, in the temple has become exceedingly rich, because people bring their coins in, and the coins themselves, because they have images of state on them, they have to be traded for coins that are acceptable to the temple at a terrible exchange rate, as well as the selling of animals at highly inflated rates as well. So there is a kind of a context, if you like, anyway, of the hypocrisy of the temple authorities that are getting very rich on this issue of standing very purely on, well, we're not going to receive foreign money because it's got foreign gods or deities on it. So the denarius it refers to in the text, they bought him a denarius. In the date that Jesus says it, the currently issued denarius is the one I've put up here. Now, there are historians who say there isn't a huge amount of evidence of a huge number of these ones in Judea at the time. You know how it goes. I used to have old pennies that had George the whatever his name, George the Eighth, wasn't it? Or sixth, seventh, and eighth. No, Anyway, old kings and queens' heads on them. We can use them for a long time after they've moved on. So there would have been denariuses with Caesar's head on them, Caesar Augustus's, and so on and so forth. But this is the particular one that was being issued by Rome at the time. And so you can see how the heart of the debate is kind of captured even on the coin itself, because on one side it reads Caesar Augustus Tiberius, that's the head that's there, son of the divine Augustus. So effectively claiming that Caesar Augustus is the son of a god, you see. Sorry, that Caesar Tiberius is the son of a god who is Augustus, who was declared to be a god after his death. So that's a good reason why the temple won't accept these for offerings in the offering pots, which is why you have to change your money if you're going to go to, and which is why you have the money traders in the court of the Gentiles, which Jesus has turned over those tables the day before. And interestingly, on the obverse side, if you turn the coin over, it says Pontiff Maxim, which is short for Pontifex Maximus, which means the highest priest, which of course becomes the title of the Pope, for those who know their kind of Roman history. So there's a kind of a real contrast even in the imagery of the coin, which I tend to think, let me just have a look, am I just checking I'm recording? Yeah, I am recording. I tend to think if it was this particular coin, that it creates a really nice contrast, because in many ways it means that the words of Jesus, which are quite important in his response, so they're quite important because they've affected history quite strategically. They really do cut to the very heart of the conflict and really draw out the grace of what Jesus gives us. So we'll think about that grace in a second. So he takes the coin, takes the denarius, and he asks, whose image and inscription is this? Where are we? Let's come over here. And so they said to him, Caesar's, and he answered to them, so give back to Caesar. The give back is fine to translate it that way, not rather than just give. It's to give back to Caesar the things that are of Caesar, and to God the things that are of God. Now, hearing this, they were impressed and left him and went away, which is the end of this passage. So there are two things. One, the word marvelled or impressed, whatever translation really is. So there is a kind of a sense in which they recognised that they had set this trap. It's a highly emotive issue. People have different views. It was probably there because they wanted to capture some words from Jesus, which they could report back to Pilate, because when they take Jesus to Pilate, they claim that he gave them an answer and said people shouldn't pay tax, which is perhaps what they were expecting. So Jesus has given them a really good answer. They're impressed. But if we come to these words and we think about them in their context, and they've been debated right since the days of the early church fathers, and almost always in the debate there is a division of some sort between the idea of the power and authority of the state and of the church. And so the division of church and state, which is perhaps best expressed in a republic like the United States, but actually even all the way through, there's been these words have caused a conversation and debates, and people have answered them slightly differently. But at the heart of them, it's not even to kind of that you can argue that Jesus is saying, as long as they're doing godly things, do what they say. He just drops the words in and has this big contrast, because here is a coin where Caesar is claiming to be son of a god and the great high priest, something which theologically the New Testament is going to claim Jesus is the son of God and the highest priest, a la Hebrews. And so there is a total conflict. Is Caesar the Antichrist, the Christ and the Antichrist? But Jesus' answer kind of draws them to the fact and shows, if you like, a sense of grace in the mix. First of all, there is a hypocrisy, and if we don't acknowledge it, then we become hypocritical in these things, which is I live in a world as a taxpayer where I have a government that may do things that I feel are counter to my Christian faith. From running the Tavistock Clinic on taxpayers' money, for instance, through to building arms and sending them to be used in parts of the world against innocent people. There are a whole stack of things that I don't like, but the reality is I can't choose the world I have been born into, and we are to engage with it and be salt and light in it, which means we must trade within it. And it's impossible, and I really do mean impossible, for us to keep ourselves pure. We're called to be in the world, but not of it. It's almost, but it would be impossible even to try and live a withdrawed life from the world, which in one sense wouldn't contribute or draw from benefits that this wider state of affairs gives us. So although I might complain about the potholes in my road, I'm part of a community. I financially benefit from it, just as I have to financially contribute to it. And there's very little I can do about that. And sometimes it is opposed to what God is, or what I should do in terms of my relationship with him. But Jesus kind of allows us to understand that we can live life with clean conscience, understanding that it is important I play my part in a social world with all of its brokenness and corruption. And yet, if I'm kind of giving my gifts and dues properly to the Lord in their own way, his grace covers me in those other things. And so this the debate around the meaning of these words has different Christians have concluded that you draw the lines at different places. And that's fine in my mind. The fact is they have to discuss it, and Jesus gives them this gives these words in a context where you've got two levels of compromise going on. The whole temple system has even the way Herod has built it has created a financial model where it takes in money, changes it for money that's acceptable within the temple. It's all benefiting from and participating in the systems of the world. So let's not pretend we can do anything other. And just understand that we have an obligation to live in the world in God's way, but in doing it in God's way, we're giving his obligations to him as well at the same time. So I wouldn't try to summarize the different theological positions that have been taken for literally 2,000 years, but to recognize that very often what we think of as the freedom in the Christian world, which has often varied depending on time and context, but they've often emerged in a kind of a context of this debate. And these words of Jesus have been so foundational in them that even the secular historians actually acknowledge that the idea of the separation of state and church are there in Jesus and are unique to him. So that's the kind of the summary as we've finally got there. And hopefully my connection is surviving this time and not going to freeze me up and throw me out. So would anyone like to ask any questions or make any contributions?